In the metallic shadows of the urban maze, the truth is a flickering light that guides the brave through the night. We bring you the most compelling tales of survival and hope from the corners of the world that never sleep. Hit subscribe now and follow the light with us.
The kitchen smelled like garlic and rosemary, and I had spent 3 hours getting everything exactly right. I'd set the table with the linen napkins my grandmother left me, the cream ones with the tiny embroidered edges she brought from Ireland decades ago. I'd ordered a custom cake from the bakery 2 streets over. I'd even made a playlist, soft acoustic, the kind of music my mom used to hum while she did dishes when I was little, back when I still believed she saw me the same way she saw my brother. That's when my phone lit up on the counter. "Hey, we're going to sit this one out. Your brother's closing on his place next week and we're helping him get settled. You know how it is. Congrats, though." It was from my dad. I read it twice, then a third time. I kept waiting for a follow-up. Just kidding, a "will stop by later." Anything. The 3 dots never appeared. He'd said what he came to say, and that was that. I set my phone face down on the counter and stood very still for a moment, listening to the playlist I'd made for them playing softly in the background. Then I picked up my phone, typed "of course, no worries," and hit send. They had no idea that the place I'd just bought, the one they couldn't be bothered to visit, had been featured in Architectural Digest 6 weeks earlier. I grew up in a house where the rules were different depending on which child you were. My brother Tyler is 4 years older than me. He was the one who got the car at 16. He was the one whose college tuition was paid in full without a conversation. He was the one my parents drove 8 hours to see when he graduated, and then again when he got his first apartment, and again when he changed jobs, and again when he adopted a dog. Every milestone in Tyler's life was a family event. Mine were things that happened to me while my parents were busy with something else. I don't think they were cruel people. I'd spent a lot of years trying to figure out if they were, and I keep landing in the same place. They weren't cruel. They were just careless. They didn't dislike me. They just liked him more, and they never once thought to hide it. When I was 9, I won a regional art competition, a real one, through the school district, with a certificate and everything. My mom said that's sweet and put the certificate in a drawer. The following weekend, my parents threw Tyler a party because his baseball team had made it to the county semifinals. They rented a bounce house. I stood in the backyard watching other people's kids jump around and ate my cake and told myself I didn't care. I got very good at telling myself I didn't care. By the time I was in high school, I had learned to want less. Not because I was naturally easygoing. I wasn't. But because it hurt less to expect nothing than to expect something and get the drawer again. I stopped telling my parents about things I was proud of. I stopped asking them to come to events. I built a smaller, quieter life inside the bigger family life, and I lived there. My guidance counselor junior year was the first adult who told me I was genuinely talented. Her name was Miss Hendricks, and she said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something you just assume the other person already knows. She was talking about my portfolio. I'd been doing graphic work since I was 12, logos, layouts, the school paper, eventually websites for local businesses who paid me in cash and gift cards. She said, "Have you thought seriously about design school?" I had. I just hadn't thought it was possible. My parents, when I brought it up at dinner, did the thing they always did. They listened just enough to respond. My dad said design was a hard field to make real money in. My mom asked if I'd looked at business administration. Tyler, who was home from college for the weekend, said, "You could always do marketing, that's kind of like design," in the helpful tone of someone who has never done either. I said okay, I'd think about it. Then I applied to the design program at the University of Oregon, got in on a partial merit scholarship, took out loans for the rest, and didn't tell my parents until 2 weeks before I left. Not out of spite, I just didn't see the point in having another dinner table conversation about whether my choices were practical. My mom cried a little when I left. My dad shook my hand. Tyler wasn't home that weekend. I drove to Eugene with my car packed to the roof and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe now, looking back, as relief. College was the first time I understood what it felt like to be in a room where people thought you had something to offer. My professors were demanding in a way that felt like respect. My classmates were competitive but also generous. We shared resources, gave each other feedback, stayed late in the studio together. I had a social life for the first time in my life that didn't feel like I was performing normalcy. I made real friends. I fell in love with the work in a way I hadn't expected, even though I'd been doing it for years. I graduated with honors and a job offer I had to turn down because the salary was too low to cover my loan payments and rent in the same city. I moved back to Portland instead, took a junior position at a mid-size agency, and started freelancing on nights and weekends to make the math work. Those first 2 years were genuinely hard. I'm not going to romanticize them. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a window that faced a brick wall, and I ate a lot of rice and frozen vegetables, and I was tired in a way that sat behind my eyes. But I was building something, and I knew it, even when it didn't feel like it. The freelance work grew faster than the day job. By the time I was 26, I had a small but steady roster of clients, mostly tech startups and local businesses who found me through referrals. I quit the agency. I raised my rates. I got better clients. I raised my rates. I got better clients. I raised my rates again. At 28, a boutique branding studio offered me a partnership. It wasn't a huge firm, 4 of us total, but we were good and we were selective. And within 18 months we had worked with clients whose names I still can't say publicly because of NDAs, but whose logos you would recognize immediately. I made more money in my first year as a partner than my dad had made in any single year of his career. I didn't know that for certain at the time. I found out later, the way you find out things in families. Accidentally, during an argument I wasn't supposed to overhear. I didn't tell my parents any of this as it was happening. Not because I wanted to hide it. Not exactly. Every time I imagined the conversation, I could hear my dad asking if it was stable, and my mom wondering if I had good health insurance, and Tyler saying something well-meaning and slightly condescending, and the whole thing landing with a thud the way it always did. So I let the updates get shorter. Doing well, work is busy, yes, I'm eating enough. That was the shape of most of our calls. I saw them at Thanksgiving and Christmas. I brought wine. I asked about Tyler. I drove home afterward and felt the specific tiredness that comes not from the visit itself, but from all the years of visits stacked underneath it. The house came at the end of a year that changed a lot of things. My business partner Simone, who had become one of my closest friends in the process of us building something together, got married and relocated to Austin. We dissolved the partnership amicably, divided the client list, and I kept running under my own name. I was 31. I had savings I'd never spent, a reputation in the industry that was starting to reach people I'd never met, and a growing feeling that the studio apartment I'd upgraded to 3 years ago had become a waiting room for a life I hadn't started yet. I started looking at houses the way you look at things you don't actually think you'll buy, casually, online, late at night when you should be sleeping. And then one Saturday, a realtor I'd met at a client event asked if I wanted to see a few properties just to get a sense of the market. The third house she showed me was in a quiet neighborhood in northwest Portland. It was a 1920s craftsman that had been completely renovated, original hardwood floors refinished, a kitchen that was entirely new, a back porch with a view of the West Hills that made me stand there for probably 4 minutes without saying anything. It had a studio space above the garage with its own entrance, which I could use as a proper office. It was more than I'd planned to spend. I spent the following week building spreadsheets and talking to my financial advisor, a woman named Brenda who had been managing my investments for 2 years and who had said more than once that I was significantly underestimating my own financial position. She looked at the numbers and said, "This is very doable. Do you want the house?" I said yes. I closed 8 weeks later. Planning the housewarming took me longer than I expected, not because I was indecisive, but because I kept second-guessing the guest list. Not the friends, that part was easy. Simone flew up from Austin. My college roommate Joe drove down from Seattle. My friend Darius, who I'd met at an industry conference 4 years ago and who had talked me into raising my rates at least twice when I was undercharging, came with his husband and a bottle of wine that cost more than my first month's rent in Eugene. My neighbor Fran, who was 73 and had already brought me tomatoes from her garden twice, said she would be there and asked if she could bring a pie. I said absolutely. The family part was harder. I told myself it was the right thing to do. Invite them. Give them the chance to show up. People surprise you sometimes, and even if they didn't, I would know I'd extended the invitation, and that would be its own kind of closure. So I called my mom on a Tuesday evening in October and told her I'd bought a house in Northwest Portland and I was having a housewarming on the 15th, and I'd love to have them there. There was a pause. Then she said, "Oh, how big is it?" Not a congratulations, not even wow, just how big is it? I described the house. She made a few sounds that meant she was listening. She said she'd talk to my dad and let me know. 2 days later, my dad texted, "Hey, we're going to sit this one out. Your brother's closing on his place next week and we're helping him get settled. You know how it is. Congrats though." Tyler was buying a condo. A 2-bedroom condo in Beaverton, which is 20 minutes from where we grew up, which is 45 minutes from Portland, which, and I want to be precise here, is not by any reasonable definition a conflict that requires my parents to miss my housewarming. Tyler's closing was on a Tuesday. My housewarming was on a Saturday. The two events were in different weeks on the calendar. But I already knew that was the point. It was never actually about the scheduling. I sat with my phone for a minute. Then I typed "of course, no worries," and I hit send and I put my phone in a drawer and finished cooking. The housewarming was the best evening I can remember in a long time. Simone brought her wife Maya, who I hadn't met in person yet, and the two of them showed up with a cast iron pan and a card that made me cry in the kitchen before people arrived. Jo brought her daughter, who is 6, and spent 45 minutes on the back porch identifying birds with a seriousness that I found deeply moving. Darius gave a toast that was technically about the house but mostly about the version of me he'd watched evolve over 4 years, and I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Fran brought the pie. It was peach. It was extraordinary. We ate on the back porch as the light changed over the hills. We talked for 4 hours. Nobody looked at their phone much. When everyone left, I stood in my kitchen, with the deep farmhouse sink and the open shelving I'd spent a week second-guessing, and I felt something that took me a moment to name. It was peace, just peace, uncomplicated and solid. I didn't think about my parents that night, or Tyler, or the text. I thought about Fran's pie and the way Joe's daughter had said, "That one's a Stellar's J," with complete authority, and Darius laughing so hard at his own toast that he had to stop and collect himself. That was my housewarming. Those were my people. The Architectural Digest thing came about through a series of coincidences that I still find a little surreal when I think about them. One of my clients, a hospitality group I'd done a complete brand overhaul for, had an ownership connection to a boutique hotel that was being featured in the magazine. The journalist doing the piece wanted to include commentary from the creative team behind the visual identity. My client gave my name. The journalist called me. I talked to her for 40 minutes, and 4 weeks later, I was in the print issue and the online feature named, quoted, and photographed alongside the work. I knew about the feature before it ran. I didn't tell my parents. This wasn't a strategic decision. I genuinely just didn't. The habit of keeping things separate was so old by then that it operated on its own. The issue hit stands on a Thursday. By Sunday, my aunt had seen it. She's my mom's older sister, and she's always been the more attentive one, the one who actually read the cards you sent, the one who remembered your college major. She called me Sunday morning and said, "I saw the magazine at the salon yesterday and I almost fell out of the chair. Why didn't you tell anyone?" I said, "I don't know. I guess I didn't think it was that big a deal." She was quiet for a second, and then she said very gently, "Sweetheart, it's a very big deal." By Tuesday, my phone had started doing something it almost never did. Ringing, not just my aunt, people I hadn't heard from in years. Distant cousins, a woman who'd been my mom's college roommate and apparently still followed her on Facebook. Everyone had seen it or heard about it or been sent a photo of the page. My mom called Wednesday morning. She opened with, "Why didn't you tell us you were going to be in a magazine?" Not congratulations. Not even "I saw the piece, it was wonderful." Just, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "I didn't know it would be a big thing." She said, "Your father and I had to hear about it from your aunt." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "Mom, You didn't come to my housewarming. Silence. Your brother needed us, she said. I know, I said. I know that's what it was. I didn't say anything else. She filled the silence with a few things about how busy things had been and how they'd been meaning to come see the house and maybe they can visit next month. I said that would be nice. I said I had to get to a call. I said goodbye. My dad texted an hour later. Saw the magazine thing. Really proud. You've come a long way. I stared at that for a while. You've come a long way. From what, I kept thinking. From what starting point exactly? From the daughter you put in the drawer. From the kid who drove to college alone because you'd already said your goodbyes. From the person who spent years keeping her life small enough that it wouldn't require anything from you. I didn't text back that night. I went for a walk through the neighborhood instead. Past the park at the end of my street, past the coffee shop where I'd started doing my best thinking on Saturday mornings. The air was cold and clean and smelled like autumn leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace. I thought about what my aunt had said. It's a very big deal. And it was. Not the magazine, though that was genuinely meaningful, but the whole thing, the house, the work, the dinner on the porch with people who had driven hours to be there. The life I had built, quietly, while other people were busy being noticed. That was a very big deal. My brother called the following Friday, Tyler. He'd seen the feature. He said he was proud of me and I believed him. Tyler's never been the problem, not really. He just grew up in the same house I did and absorbed the same lesson without questioning it, that he was the main character and I was supporting cast, and that was just how families worked. He said, I didn't know you had gotten I didn't know things were going that well. I said, I know. He said, you should have told us more. And I almost laughed, not meanly. I wasn't angry at Tyler in that moment. I was just tired of a very old argument that had been conducted in silences for most of my life. You should have told us more. As if the telling would have changed the listening. As if I hadn't tried 100 times and gotten the drawer. I said, maybe. We talked for a while longer. He told me about the condo. He said my parents had spent the weekend helping him arrange furniture, and he seemed happy about it. Genuinely, the way you're happy when you're used to being someone's priority and you've never thought to wonder what that feels like from the other side. I wished him well with the condo. I meant it. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a while, looking out at the back porch. The light was coming in at that angle. It gets in early November, low and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look more significant than usual. I thought about what I wanted my life to look like going forward. Not in terms of the work or the money or the house. Those things were, in some ways, the easier part. I thought about the family piece, the thing I'd been carrying since I was 9 years old in the backyard watching other people's kids jump on a bounce house. I decided I wasn't going to carry it the same way anymore. Not because I'd stopped caring. I'm not sure I'll ever completely stop caring, and I've made peace with that. But because the caring had been taking up space I needed for other things. For Simone and Joe and Darius. For Fran and her peach pie. For the clients who sent me long grateful emails and the strangers on the internet who'd written to me after the ADP saying my work had changed how they thought about their own spaces. For the 6-year-old who knew every bird on my porch without hesitating. I wasn't going to cut my parents off dramatically. I wasn't going to have a confrontation, or write a letter, or do any of the things that make for a satisfying narrative, but rarely make for a satisfying life. I was going to do something quieter. I was going to let them exist at exactly the distance they'd always chosen. And I was going to stop pretending that distance didn't come from them. My mom and dad did visit the house. 2 months later, a Saturday in January, they drove up from Beaverton and arrived at noon like we'd planned. My mom walked in and stopped in the entryway and looked around and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "This is beautiful." My dad put his hands in his pockets and looked at the ceilings and said, "Solid place." I showed them around, the kitchen, the living room, the porch, the studio above the garage where I work. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and it was fine. It was pleasant. We talked about ordinary things. My mom asked about the neighborhood. My dad asked about the mortgage rate, which I answered vaguely and he didn't push. At one point, my mom picked up the frame on the windowsill, a photo from the housewarming, Simone and Joe and me on the back porch, the three of us laughing at something Darius had said right before the shutter clicked. My mom looked at it for a moment and said, "These are your good friends?" "My best friends," I said. She nodded slowly. She set the frame back down. They left in the early afternoon. My dad hugged me at the door. My mom said the house was really, really lovely. I said I was glad they'd come. I watched their car pull out of the driveway, and then I went inside and stood in my kitchen for a moment, in the quiet. The visit had been fine. That's the whole truth of it. Just fine. There was no big revelation, no tearful reconciliation, no moment where everything that had been wrong got suddenly right. There was just my parents, in my house, finally, 2 months late, doing their best within the limits of who they were. And I think I had finally, after 31 years, stopped waiting for their best to be something different. I poured the rest of the coffee. I put on the playlist I'd made for the housewarming, the one that had been playing in an empty kitchen when my dad's text came in that October evening. I went out to the back porch and sat in the cold air and looked at the hills. I had built something real, not just the house, everything, the work, the friendships, the quiet, the life. They hadn't seen any of it happening. That used to feel like the saddest part. Lately, it had started to feel like the most honest part. I had done it without an audience, and it was mine. I keep coming back to that text from my dad, not because it hurt, though it did, but because of how small it was. One paragraph. A shrug dressed up as an explanation. "Your brother needs us. You know how it is. Congrats, though." That word at the end always gets me. Congrats, though, like an afterthought stapled onto a door closing in my face. For a long time, I thought the problem was that my parents didn't see me, and that's partly true. But what I've come to understand, slowly and without any dramatic moment of clarity, is that I had also stopped letting myself be seen. Not by them. By then, I'd learned that was pointless, but by myself. I'd gotten so good at keeping my life small and quiet that I'd started to believe small and quiet was all I deserved, that the drawer was where things like me belonged. What changed wasn't the house, or the magazine, or any single achievement. What changed was a decision I made so gradually I barely noticed it happening. I decided to take my own life seriously. Not perform it for anyone, not wait for permission, not shrink it to fit what other people were willing to acknowledge. Just take it seriously. Do the work. Build the thing. Trust that the effort had value even when no one in my family was watching. That's the part nobody tells you about growing up in a house where you're the afterthought. You can spend decades waiting to be seen clearly by the people who were supposed to see you first, or you can stop waiting and start building a life so full and so genuinely yours that their absence becomes, over time, just one true thing about your history rather than the defining fact of your present. I'm not someone who believes that doing right automatically brings reward, or that the universe keeps a ledger. What I do believe, because I've lived it, is that integrity compounds. Every time I took a client seriously when I could have cut corners. Every time I raised my rates because the work was worth it. Every time I showed up for Simone or Joe or Darius the way they showed up for me. Every time I chose honesty over performance and effort over shortcuts. Those things stacked. Quietly. Without anyone handing me a certificate. And the intelligence piece. I don't mean book smarts. I mean the harder kind. The kind that looks at a painful situation and asks what is actually true here instead of just what hurts. What was true was that my parents had limits I hadn't caused and couldn't fix. What was true was that I had built something real. What was true was that the people on my back porch that October night, laughing, pouring wine, pointing at Stellar's jays, were my family in every way that mattered. When my parents finally came to the house in January, I didn't feel the vindication I thought I might. I felt something quieter. I felt clear. They walked through my kitchen, my living room, my life, the life I had built without them. And I realized I didn't need them to understand it. I just needed to keep living it. My dad said I'd come a long way. I didn't tell him what I was thinking, but what I was thinking was, I didn't come a long way. I built the road,